You typed the message, you read it back, and then you deleted it. Not because it was wrong, not because it was rude, but because something in you said, that's too much. They don't want to hear all of that. So you compressed it, or you said nothing at all, and you moved on like it never happened. If that moment felt familiar, not as a memory, but as a reflex, then you already know what this video is about. Not because you've heard this before, but because you've lived it quietly in 1,000 variations for most of your life. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly managing how much of yourself is allowed to appear. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't look like trauma from the outside. It just feels like a permanent low-grade vigilance. A background process always running, always asking, is this too much? Am I too much? What I want to offer today is not a diagnosis. It's a mirror. Because the 7 things we're going to look at aren't character flaws. They're not proof that something is wrong with you. They are the fingerprints of a very specific kind of emotional history. One that left a mark not on your biography, but on your nervous system. Stay with me. What you're about to recognize in yourself is not a reason for shame. It's the beginning of something else entirely. Before we go deeper, if something in these first few seconds already landed somewhere familiar in you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. What's one moment where you felt like you had to shrink your emotions just to be accepted? You don't have to explain it fully. Even a sentence carries weight. Like this video if it's already speaking to something real, and subscribe if you want to keep exploring this kind of territory. Now, let's keep going. There's a label that gets applied to certain children. Never officially, never in writing, but with a remarkable consistency. It doesn't come from cruelty most of the time. It comes from discomfort, from parents who were never taught to hold big emotions, from classrooms that reward stillness over aliveness, from family systems where keeping the peace required everyone to want less, feel less, take up less space. The label is simple. You're too much. Sometimes it was said directly, you're too sensitive, you're too dramatic, you're overreacting again. Sometimes it was communicated without words, a sigh, a glance, a sudden emotional chill in the room that told you your feelings had once again exceeded the acceptable limit. It doesn't matter how it was delivered. What matters is what happened next. You received that message, and because you were a child, and because children need connection more than they need accuracy, you didn't question it. You adapted to it. You began the long, invisible work of making yourself smaller, not all at once, but gradually, behavior by behavior, until the smallness started to feel like your actual size. Jung understood this dynamic at its core. He wrote that the things we cannot bear to be seen as, we eventually stop allowing ourselves to see in ourselves. The emotional intensity that made the adults in your life uncomfortable didn't disappear, it went underground. It became what he would call a complex. A nucleus of charged emotional material organized around the central belief, I am too much, and that is dangerous. The complex isn't a wound in the simple sense. It's more like a lens that gets installed without your permission, one that filters how you interpret relationships, how you experience your own reactions, and what you believe is safe to reveal. And the most powerful thing about a complex is that it doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like reality. So let's look at what that reality produces. 7 behaviors. 7 doors into the same buried room. The first thing people who grew up feeling like too much learn to do is edit themselves before anyone else gets the chance. This is the deleted message. But it's also the opinion you started forming and then quietly let dissolve before it left your mouth. The enthusiasm you felt and then immediately assessed. Will this seem strange? Will they match it? Should I tone this down? The story you almost told but summarized into something smaller, something easier to receive. This is not lying. It's something more intimate than that. It's a real-time negotiation between who you are and who you've learned is acceptable. Before anyone judges you, you judge yourself, and you hand them a pre-approved version. The editing happens so fast that most people who do it no longer register it as a choice. It feels like personality. I'm just a private person, I'm just thoughtful before I speak, and maybe sometimes that's true, but there's a difference between choosing to be selective and being unable to stop the filter from running. One is agency. The other is a reflex formed in self-defense. Ask yourself, when was the last time you said something and immediately scanned the other person's face for a sign that you'd said too much? That scan what? Nah, that quick, almost unconscious read of the room is not social intelligence. It's the old monitoring system still doing its job decades after the original threat has passed. The second behavior follows naturally from the first, though it runs in a different direction. Where the first is about prevention, The second is about repair. You apologize for your emotions, not for your actions, for your feelings themselves. Sorry, I don't know why I'm crying. Sorry, I'm just being sensitive. Sorry, ignore me. I'm overreacting. The apology arrives before anyone has said a word, before anyone has indicated that your emotion is inconvenient. You preemptively dismantle your own response so that no one else has to ask you to. This is remarkably common in people who received early, repeated signals that their emotional expressions created problems. The apology is not false humility. It's a survival strategy that was at one point actually useful. When showing distress made the adults around you more distressed, or colder, or more distant, learning to apologize for it was a way of maintaining the relationship. I know this is too much. I'm sorry. Please don't leave. The tragedy is that the strategy outlives the situation. You are no longer a child in a home where your tears were a disruption, but the apology still comes because the complex doesn't check the calendar. It responds to emotional activation the same way it always has, with damage control. You don't feel too much. You just learn that your feelings were inconvenient. The third thing people who grew up feeling like too much do as adults is read between lines that don't exist. A friend responds to your message with a shorter reply than usual, and something in you begins to quietly gather evidence. Did I say something wrong? Have I been too intense lately? Are they pulling away? You're not panicking. You're not even consciously worried. But somewhere below the level of conscious thought, a process has been activated. Scan for signs of emotional withdrawal. This is hypervigilance, one of the most misunderstood features of an emotional complex. It is not anxiety in the ordinary sense. It is the result of growing up in environments where other people's moods had direct consequences for your emotional safety. When a parent's silence meant disapproval, when warmth was conditional, when you could never quite predict what would trigger distance or tension, widow, you learned to read the room at extraordinary resolution, and you got very good at it. The problem is that this skill, developed in a specific context, generalizes to all contexts. Now you're reading every room with instruments calibrated for a reality that no longer surrounds you. You detect signals that aren't there. You construct narratives from fragments. You feel the shift in someone's tone 3 words before it's visible to anyone else in the room. What if the problem was never your intensity, but where it landed? The fourth behavior lives at the intersection of love and self-erasure. You feel responsible for other people's comfort, not in the way a thoughtful person considers others, in the way that you find yourself adjusting your emotional temperature to match someone else's comfort threshold. Automatically, habitually, even when no one has asked you to. You sense that someone is tired and you make yourself lighter. You notice that someone seems uncomfortable with emotional depth and you shift into surface level conversation without announcing the transition. You absorb the unspoken emotional needs of a room and quietly reorganize yourself around them. This is sometimes called being empathic, and it is. But it is empathy in service of the complex, empathy that has been trained to function as a safety mechanism. If I can keep everyone comfortable, no one will find me to be too much. If I can manage the emotional temperature of this interaction, I won't be the disruption I learned I was. Jung observed that the unconscious has a way of turning our greatest gifts into our greatest burden when they are not integrated consciously. The capacity to feel what others feel, to anticipate needs, to attune to emotional nuance, these are extraordinary. But when they are driven by fear rather than freedom, they extract a quiet, continuous cost. You were never the problem. But somewhere in your life, being fully yourself became unsafe. The fifth behavior is perhaps the most misunderstood by people who haven't experienced it from the inside. You withhold your intensity until it leaks. The withholding is the visible part, the restraint, the careful modulation, the way you hold your reactions in. People who know you might describe you as calm, self-contained, controlled, and on the surface that's accurate. But what they can't see is what that control costs. The constant internal pressure of feeling something fully while expressing only a fraction of it. Because here's the truth that the complex doesn't advertise. What gets suppressed doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And at some point, usually when the context shifts, when the guard comes down, when the relationship deepens or the stress increases, it leaks. Not in a dramatic eruption, usually, more like a sudden brightness that surprises everyone, including you. A reaction that seems disproportionate to the immediate trigger. A depth of emotion that feels, to the outside observer, as though it came from nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from everywhere. From the accumulated weight of 100 small suppressions. From all the messages you deleted. from all the apologies you offered before anyone asked, from all the ways you made yourself smaller. People who were called too much don't express less, they hide better. Before we continue, I want to pause here for a moment. Everything we're exploring in this video, I know it can awaken something, a recognition that goes beyond intellectual curiosity, a sense that you're not just understanding something new, but finally having a name for something very old. I've been there too. And when I realized that what I needed wasn't more information. I needed structure, a way to actually move through this material rather than just observe it. If that's where you are right now, there's a link in the description. Take a look when the video ends. It's there for the people who are ready to go deeper than a single video allows. Now let's keep going. Bingo 6, Ikimalaozo, because what comes next changes the frame entirely. We've looked at 5 behaviors, 5 ways the same underlying pattern expresses itself. And if you've been recognizing yourself in the edited messages, in the preemptive apologies, in the hypervigilance, in the self-erasure, in the quiet withholding, then you deserve to understand what's actually happening. Not just what it looks like, what it is. What we're describing is not a personality type. It is not an introversion style, or a sensitivity trait, or a communication pattern. What we're describing is a complex, in the precise Jungian sense of that word. Jung defined a complex as an emotionally charged cluster of associations and memories organized around a central theme, operating largely outside of conscious awareness and influencing thought, feeling, and behavior in automatic, repetitive ways. The key word there is automatic. And the complex doesn't feel like a choice. It doesn't feel like a belief you're holding. It feels like the way things simply are. The too much complex forms when a child receives consistent, emotionally loaded feedback that their natural level of emotional expression is excessive, burdensome, or dangerous to the relationships they depend on. Over time, this feedback doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes identity. The child stops thinking I had a response that was too big for this situation. They begin to think I am too much. My inside life is too large for the outside world. This is the distinction that matters more than anything else in this video. The difference between a situational response and a core belief about self. When you hold the belief implicitly, without even knowing it consciously, that your emotional depth is inherently burdensome, every subsequent emotional experience gets filtered through that belief. You feel deeply and immediately wonder if you should. You have a reaction and immediately reach for the apology. You start to say something real and immediately sense the edit needed. The complex runs in the background like an operating system, invisible, persistent, shaping the interface between you and the world. Now here is the part that Jung was most insistent about. The complex is not a flaw, it is a response. It was formed in a specific relational context, with specific people, under specific conditions. It was adaptive. It served a function and it carries inside it. This is the part people often miss, the very thing that was suppressed. Think of it this way. Imagine a high-fidelity sound system, capable of producing extraordinary range, nuance, depth, resonance, but placed in an environment where that level of sound was experienced as overwhelming, it was turned down. Progressively, continuously, until it was operating at a fraction of its actual capacity. The problem was never the system. The problem was the mismatch between the system's capacity and the environment's tolerance. You are not too much. You are a high-resolution inner life that was asked to play at low volume for so long that you forgot the dial could be moved. The 6th behavior happens in the aftermath of real intimacy. You shrink after being fully seen. You had a moment, a conversation, an evening, an exchange, where you let more of yourself through than usual, where you weren't editing, where the depth came out and someone received it, and it felt, for a moment, like relief, like oxygen, and then the next day something shifts. You feel exposed, you begin to review what you said, how much you revealed, whether it was too much. You pull back, subtly, almost imperceptibly. You become a little more careful, a little more distant. You reinstall the filter that you temporarily removed. This is the complex reasserting itself after a threat response. The threat is not the other person. The threat is intimacy itself, because intimacy means visibility, and visibility, in the original context of this complex, meant vulnerability to rejection. The complex doesn't know that this person received you warmly. It only knows that you were seen. And being seen, at some point in your history, became a risk. This is why people with this pattern often describe a cycle in relationships, a period of genuine connection, followed by an inexplicable withdrawal, that neither partner fully understands. The relationship didn't do anything wrong. The complex simply did what complexes do. It protected its host from the thing it learned to fear, even when that thing was actually nourishment. The seventh behavior is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of all. You confuse depth with burden, not consciously. But in practice, somewhere in the way you relate to your own inner life, you have absorbed the idea that the intensity with which you experience things, grief, beauty, love, meaning, the weight of ordinary moments, is something to be managed, not something to be expressed. That the richness of your interior experience is at its core a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be inhabited. This is what the complex ultimately produces: a person who has internalized the external judgment so completely that they now apply it to themselves before anyone else gets the chance. You have become the one who tells yourself, this is too much, contain it. But consider what depth actually is, not sensitivity as a liability, but as a form of perception. The person who feels grief fully is the same person who can feel beauty fully. The person who experiences love with intensity is the same person who registers meaning where others see only surface. Depth is not a dysfunction, it is a relationship with reality that most people spend their entire lives trying to develop, and you arrived with it already formed. The question is not how to reduce it, the question is what to do with it. I want to take a moment here before we move into the final part of this video. If something in what you've heard today has reached a place that doesn't usually get reached, I'd be glad to know. Leave a comment with this. If you stopped seeing your intensity as a flaw, what part of you would finally be allowed to exist? You don't have to answer fully. Even sitting with the question changes something. Like the video, if this conversation has been worth your time, subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. There is so much more of this territory to explore. And there's a link in the description for those of you who feel ready to take this work further than a video can take it. It's there for when the time feels right. Everything we've looked at, the editing, the apologizing, the hypervigilance, the caretaking, the withholding, the withdrawal after intimacy, the confusion of depth for burden. These are not random behaviors. They are the architecture of a single organizing belief that was formed before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate whether it was true. The question now is what to do with that. Jung was careful never to suggest that the goal of psychological work was to eliminate the complex. That's not how the psyche operates. The complex doesn't dissolve. It integrates. The energy that was locked inside it becomes available for conscious use. What was automatic becomes, over time, a choice. Integration looks different for each person, but it tends to begin with the same movement, the willingness to let the belief be examined rather than simply obeyed. To pause in the moment when you're about to delete the message and ask, not, is this too much, but too much for whom? According to what? Based on what evidence? From what time? From what relationship that I am now applying here? That question doesn't always stop the behavior immediately, but it introduces something new into the system, awareness. And awareness is, in Jungian terms, the first real light in a room that has been dark for a long time. The people I have seen do this work slowly, seriously, without shortcuts, describe a particular sensation when the integration begins to happen. It's not joy exactly, it's not relief, though there is some relief. It's more like recognition. Like a part of themselves that had been living in the basement of their personality is finally allowed upstairs. Not because it's no longer powerful, because the rest of the house is finally large enough to hold it. Your intensity was never the problem. It was the mismatch between the depth of your inner life and the capacity of your early environment to receive it. That mismatch shaped a belief. The belief shaped a complex. The complex shaped behaviors that now feel like personality. But a complex is not a personality, it is an adaptation. And adaptations can be examined, understood, and with time and real work, transformed. So let me come back to where we started. You typed the message. You read it back. You deleted it. What if the next time that happens, you paused? Not to send it necessarily, but to read it one more time. Not as an editor, as a witness. To notice what you actually felt, what you actually wanted to say, who you actually are when the filter is briefly removed. You were called too much because someone, somewhere, did not have the capacity to hold what you were bringing. That is information about them. It became information about you only because you were too young to know the difference. You are not too loud. You are not too intense. You are not too deep. You are a particular kind of inner life that was placed for a time in a particular kind of container, one that was too small. The container was never the measure of you. Maybe you were never too much. Maybe you were always exactly enough, and the world just needed a little longer to grow large enough to receive you.